Hello. So before I start, I really want to thank Joe for giving me the opportunity to speak here instead of Annika. And I also want to mention that I learned about this opportunity to speak here just a few days ago. So please bear with me in case my slides did not really have the time to go through several iterations in making sure that all the different contributions in the field are fairly represented. Please see my slides more as our personal experience about the challenges and capabilities of high-resolution fMRI in combination with SMS. And specifically, I would like to talk about the necessity and challenges of doing caipirinha, especially when you have very close simultaneously acquired slices. I want to talk about additional sources of ghosting in SMS that we encountered, its sensitivity to motion and physiological noise across different resolutions. And I would also like to show you some of my favorite examples of doing high-resolution fMRI in combination with SMS, specifically this blood volume sensitive fMRI methods. And I will try to follow your request and really focus on the practical considerations and challenges in everyday life and throw in some real-life examples as well. Our big motivation to do SMS is that you can not only accelerate the readout, but accelerate all the other components of scanning as well. And following Setsumpop here, you can view a single slice acquisition as having two components, a contrast encoding and a readout. And sometimes the contrast encoding can be quite long, meaning that when you have a single band-like acquisition, accelerating the readout does not really help you so much because you spend most of the time on the contrast encoding. And this is where SMS can really help a lot because there you can use the same contrast encoding for several slices at the same time, and therefore SMS factor of 2 really doubles your acquisition speed and gives us more of this valuable time that we need for high-resolution imaging. And my favorite example, where you particularly have a very, very long contrast encoding time, are these non-bold fMRI methods, such as blood volume sensitive fMRI with a method called VASO, or blood flow sensitive fMRI with methods called like ASL. And there you have the contrast encoding in the T1 domain, not T2 star. So the contrast encoding duration is very, very long. And even then you only have this very limited time window available for your acquisition of only a very few slices. In this case, it would be VASO, blood volume sensitive fMRI, and bold, interleaved every about 1.5 seconds. Now with SMS, you can really multiply the number of acquired slices and obtain a decently, almost whole brain coverage with decently high resolution. And down here you see the corresponding multiband pulses and these Kaipi blips that Benjamin talked about already. And just to give you an idea what those data kind of look like, I want to show you this example of a recent study that we did where we tried to look at the high resolution activity mapping in the sensory motor system. And for a 32-channel coil, it's pretty straightforward to do an SMS factor of 3. And with a conventional image reconstruction, single band image reconstruction pipeline, you would end up with images like that, where the different slices are kind of weirdly aliased on top of each other. And due to the Kaipi field of view shifting, they have this shift between them, means that we can unalias them pretty efficiently and obtain nice high-resolution blood volume tapping-induced activity maps like this for blood volume and bold at the same time. And these kind of maps really convinced me about the value of combining non-bold fMRI with SMS. Because from the SMS, you get this high coverage, and from the blood volume sensitive fMRI, you get this very high localized specificity. Here, for example, you can really nicely separate very, very close brain areas, such as the motor cortex from the sensory cortex, which is kind of more blobby in bold, because there you have these sensitivities to the large draining veins right between those sides of the central sulcus. And it's also particularly important when you have like opposite responses at the different sides of a sulcus, which can be kind of blurred away for lower resolution imaging. When you look at those maps very carefully, however, you also see these issues that are partly SMS related as well, such as these false positives outside the brain. And in this case, it's not really a slice leakage artifact, like Ben talked about. It's more SMS-induced in-plane ghosting, which is partly due to the fact that we do in-plane acceleration with the leak block unaliasing, which has some interactions to the through-plane accelerations as well, but it's mostly due to the fact that we have these kind of very narrow slab, meaning that the simultaneously excited slices are super close to each other, which means that the Kuiper blips, to shift them and the slices from each other, are huge. So we are really driving the gradients pretty hard, meaning that we have stronger eddy currents and much larger ghosts. And just removing those Kuiper blips and not applying Kuiper, however, is also not really an option. There we have a better handle of the ghosts, however, we have these huge G-factor penalties that the first Ben talked about. Especially inside the brain, we have a much more noisy image compared to the Kuiper. So usually you would like to end up between, with a compromise between those two extremes. And in my experience, it really makes a lot of sense to spend some extra time when setting up a high-resolution SMS, fMRI protocol to play around with different combinations of Kuiper and SMS. And in my experience, it's also a much more common phenomenon that you have this problem of too close simultaneously acquired slices, which I think is partly associated with the very frequent misconception that I encountered when setting up high-resolution SMS protocols, that the number of the slices are much more tightly coupled with the SMS factors. So while for a 16-slice protocol, SMS factor of 4 with kind of thick slices might be a completely reasonable choice, while when you change the number of slices, like for example having 8 slices, the identical acceleration factors are completely unreasonable, because there the simultaneously acquired slices are very, very close to each other and cannot be unaliased that efficiently compared to the 16-slice protocol, where the distance of the aliasing slices are further away and in the range of maybe the physical size of the coil elements. So take-home message maybe, if you change your number of slices, always reconsider changing your SMS factor as well. And in light of this, it's also important to keep in mind that the distance of aliasing voxels is also dependent on the in-plane acceleration and therefore might change the effectiveness of Kuiper. So if you do a conventional SMS without Kuiper, without in-plane acceleration, the simultaneously excited slices and aliasing voxels are super close to each other. Now when you do Kuiper, it pushes the voxels further away. That's why Kuiper is so helpful. However, when you now do additional in-plane acceleration, it effectively reduces the field of view in the phase encoding direction and therefore pushes those aliasing voxels closer to each other again, meaning that we have a higher G-factor penalty and maybe a less efficient Kuiperinia. And with all these considerations, I implicitly suggested that the further away the aliasing voxels are, the better, which is kind of true, but there are also limits to that. In fact, in my experience, they also can be too far away from each other, which I want to explain with this example here, where we tried to investigate the interaction of the visuomotor system. So we had this battery of tasks where we had this moving star field paradigm, static light changes, which are specifically designed to trigger activity in area V5, MT, V1, and simultaneously we also had these hand movement tasks triggering activity in M1 and S1. And I guess you can see how this specific setup really benefits from SMS, because we can really invest all the scanning efficiency to the simultaneous excited slices and having these two slabs without really losing efficiency in acquiring all these areas in between that we are not really interested in. And the challenge here that those two slabs are too far away from each other is sometimes visible in having enhanced in-plane ghosting. And again, here these ghosts are not really the slice leakage, like Benjamin talked about. It's more the same slice aliased by parts of its field of view. And we do not really see that strong for single-band phase correction methods. And this is partly due to the fact that we have these pretty high resolutions, meaning that we are really pushing the gradient to their limits and are sometimes close to the acoustic resonances of the coils, which results in much larger eddy currents. And these eddy currents are kind of complex in space and different across slices. And these eddy currents are generally very challenging for EPI. So let's look at the K-space acquisition, for example, here at slab number 1. And when we want to acquire the K-space there, we usually go through K-space back and forth and back and forth. And you can see this very common feature of EPI that the odd and even lines might be shifted with respect to each other, which is very common in EPI and usually corrected for with Navigator and the phase correction procedure. Now in SMS, we have two slices at the same time acquired, meaning that these eddy currents might be different across slices. For example, it's in this example much bigger in slab number 1 compared to slab number 2. So it's not so straightforward anymore to do a simple kind of phase correction in K-space before you unalias them. And you can only in first order do this kind of mean ghost correction. And this is explained in much more details in those references with potential solutions such as these dual kernels. And when you take good care of those kind of ghosting artifacts, then you can get pretty nice results for these very far simultaneously acquired slices and unalias them pretty efficiently to get high resolution fMRI results. And in this case, it really helps us that the two slabs are far away from each other in the sense that the T-factor penalties are pretty low anyway, and so we don't really need to apply much Chi-P at all. And the blue voxels here refer to the sensitivity for static light changes, and the red ones, specifically in area V5MT, refer to these moving light changes of these star field paradigms. And again, we see M1, S1 nicely separated. And I'm not sure if you can see it on the screen, but you might be able to appreciate that the activity really follows the cortical ribbon here, especially in blood volume sensitive fMRI. When you look at those images very carefully, again, you can see additional sources of artifacts that are partly due to SMS, such as these green voxels referring to task-correlated motion artifacts. And I would like to discuss them in more details with respect to this calibration Valsalva task, which is basically a breath-holding task with an additional chest pressure increase. And just yesterday, I saw this tweet from Molly Bright quoting hand workers saying that if you think you have a stable sequence, do a breath-holding. And this is what we did here. So with this Valsalva task. And this Valsalva task is a pretty awesome task. It has a huge contrast to noise ratio. So for example, for blood volume sensitive fMRI, you really might see these big arteries popping up or the big veins jumping at you with some simultaneously acquired bold, completely visible with the naked eye without any fancy analysis method necessary. However, you also see these kind of motion effects of the whole brain. And in this case, it's particularly a pitch motion, a head nodding effect that is triggered and correlated to the task. And this is particularly challenging in SMS because in SMS you have these kind of weird interleaved slice acquisition order in the sense that the simultaneously excited slices are acquired in a consecutive fashion until you have the whole volume, meaning that neighboring slices here that are very, very close in the anatomical space can be far away from each other in the temporal acquisition time domain. So they might have very different spin history effects. And now when you have this kind of a very strong head nodding during this breath holding, then the brain moves with respect to these borderlines of these different spin history effects. And after the retrospective motion correction, the brain is still, but now this borderline kind of moves, which results in huge signal changes in individual slices, especially in the anterior and posterior part of the brain. And when you want to look at the breath-holding induced signal changes, you might be able to see the big vessels in the center here, but it's really overlaid with this huge artifact. And in this case, I believe that there might be other methods that could account for these kind of motions more efficiently, such as this 3D EPI. And 3D EPI came along and was introduced for highly accelerated fMRI pretty much at the same time as SMS, however, without really receiving all this attention from the human connectome network, even though it can really do the same kind of through-plane and within-plane accelerations and do that Chi-P field of view shifting all in K-space. And the big difference of 3D EPI compared to 2D EPI with SMS is that you do not acquire the different slices in a consecutive fashion, but you acquire all the slices at the same time over and over again and just vary the different spatial frequency weighting until you have the same resolution as in both cases. Which means that you don't really have these borderlines of different spin history effects, and when you have this kind of head nodding, you can correct for it much more efficiently with retrospective motion correction, and see these kind of breath-holding induced vessels showing up without these artifacts. And of course, 3D EPI is not immune to motion. And if you have motion during the K-space acquisition, then it can also result in blurring. What I'm saying here is that it's the very slow inter-TR task-correlated motion where 3D EPI can shine. The big challenge of 3D EPI compared to 2D SMS might be that it's more sensitive to other sources of physiological noise, which I want to explain with this graph over here, where I try to plot the temporal signal-to-noise ratio as a function of voxel volume for both the 2D SMS in blue and the 3D EPI in red. And you can see that for both of those cases, the signal quality is better for bigger voxels, which makes sense. But the slopes are different. So in the physiological noise-dominated regime of very big voxels, 3 millimeter voxels, there the 2D SMS really outperforms 3D EPI. And this is partly due to the snapshot-like acquisition of slice-wise readouts that kind of freezes the physiological motion. And still at about 1.5 millimeter resolutions, where we start to appreciate these higher localized specificity, 2D SMS can outperform 3D EPI. And it's mostly the very thermal noise-dominated regime of sub-millimeter voxels where the 3D EPI really outperforms 2D EPI. And obviously this borderline and this crossing point is highly dependent on field strength, acceleration, and resolutions. And these are data from 70. For 3 Tesla, it might be further to the right. So if you want to do layer-dependent, ultra-high-resolution fMRI, like in this example, I would advise you to refrain from SMS and look more into 3D EPI. And there you might be able to see these patterns here of stripes following the cortical ribbon, which are there in 2D SMS, but not really as nicely visible. And just to give you an idea what kind of very exciting, valuable new information we can get from those kind of layer-dependent fMRI, I want to throw in this slice here as a preview for our poster on Thursday, where we try to look at different layer-dependent responses for different sensory motor tasks. So for a finger tapping, we usually see like these double striping patterns. And the exciting information here is that these different layers have different kind of input-output characteristics. So you can kind of look at the microcircuitry level of cortical connections. The deeper layers are mostly the ones that have the corticospinal connection, so they trigger a lot of output, while the upper layers here are mostly responsible for receiving and integrating a lot of feedback from sensory cortex or motor planning areas. And we can modulate those different layers with all kinds of different tapping tasks. For example, when you do a much slower tapping, then you have a reduced output with almost the same input. Or if you do a fast tapping, but without touching the fingers, then you have a reduced feedback from sensory cortex. Or you can also isolate this feedback from sensory cortex by doing the touch only, or looking at inhibitory feedback input through transcallosal connections with left-hand tapping. To evaluate those kind of very high-resolution data, however, you really need to have a very accurate knowledge about the underlying anatomical geometry. And I think this is where SMS come back into the game and can help us a lot to deal with those kind of challenges that we have in EPI, namely the big distortions. So here I'm flipping back and forth EPI T1 maps and MP2 range T1 maps, and you can see that the distortions can be pretty big, especially at high resolutions and high fields. But you can see that the cortex moves not only across different layers, but sometimes across the whole cortical ribbon. And it's not so straightforward to apply conventional distortion correction at these high resolutions without introducing some sort of blurring due to the spatial resampling step. And the most efficient way would be to apply the anatomical reference directly in the native EPI space. And this is where SMS helps so much, because SMS is basically the only method that can really give us a whole brain high resolution coverage twice within one single inversion recovery curve. So we get 2 different T1 weightings every 3 to 4 seconds following an inversion pulse, meaning that you can push those kind of data through an MP2 range-like reconstruction pipeline and obtain quantitative T1 maps directly with the identical distortions as your functional EPI data. However, with enough contrast-to-noise ratio that you can do meaningful segmentations on them. With the other nice advantage as well, that it only takes 3 to 4 seconds to acquire one of those T1 maps. And if you want to have very high contrast-to-noise ratio, like in this image, 10 averages of 30-second acquisition time is completely enough. So in conclusion, SMS can really help us a lot when you want to do high-resolution fMRI, especially when you have very long contrast encoding durations. However, there are these weird interactions of EPI artifacts and SMS that need to be kept in mind, and watch out for those kind of artifacts during the setup process of your high-resolution SMS protocol, because they can be avoided. And with that, I would like to thank my collaborators who are doing this SMS work with me, Benedikt Poser and Timo Ivanov from Maastricht. We would like to thank Steve Coley for sharing their image reconstruction interface, and I thank you for your attention.
I now open the floor to any questions relating to any of the talks you've heard this morning.
So this is primarily for Benjamin Risk. You showed with the HCP data, you showed the great maps of sort of leakage and the sharp residual boundaries. With the rise of all these shared data sets, I think a lot of people sort of take for granted that the data is flawless. Do you have recommendations for, what someone should think about and what they should do to evaluate data for them? What are your highest recommendations for people to try and evaluate data to make sure it isn't biasing whatever the analysis they're trying to do? And sort of related to that, do you sort of have code that does that, that can replicate that residual analysis that other people can insert into QA analyses?
Yeah, I do have code, but I haven't made it available yet, but that's on my to-do list to put it on my GitHub. So if you email me, I can let you know the status of that. But in general, I think looking at the residuals and also potentially looking at the regions that are aliased with a region of large activation can give you insight into whether or not you're seeing some artifacts. The other thing to do is to compare the regions of activation you're getting to, say, like neurosynth. And then, for example, in a group analysis, if you seem to be getting some activation in a new area, it might be worth thinking about whether that might be due to some of these regional aliasing patterns and such.
Thank you.
Can you comment on the worth of these techniques for high field imaging, 7 Tesla and higher?
Well, I think as any kind of acceleration in plane or through plane, at high field it's much more efficient sometimes compared to lower fields. At high fields we have the possibility to go to smaller voxel sizes, which increases the readout in generally duration, so it makes it that these acceleration methods are more effective and also more desired at high fields. So I think at high fields you always should do some sort of acceleration. Yeah.
So you don't think that there's also greater risk for artifact? That's what I thought you were going to say.
Well, at high fields you have the same kind of conceptual family of artifacts as at low fields, and they're usually much more pronounced, and any kind of artifacts, like these EPI artifacts, are more pronounced. And I think that they are manageable if you understand them and look out for them. You can suppress them, and of course the sensitivity and the susceptibility to those kind of artifacts are more pronounced.
So thank you for the talks. So once you have the images, what would you recommend for motion correction or distortion correction? For example, we're using top-up correction for distortion correction or ICA-based motion correction. What would you say about that?
Yeah, do you want to talk about like the band pass or anything like that?
Difficult to answer. I guess in an ideal world, there should be no difference between your multi-band acquisition and a single-band acquisition. So whatever is true, or whatever processing pipeline that you're comfortable with, you should also use it for your multi-band acquisition. Does that answer your question? I guess not. Sorry.
Well, I've seen even on your slides that there were visible distortions. which I don't know from EPI images. So, and we see those distortions also in our images. So I guess maybe there is an increased need for distortion correction in multiband images as compared to non-multiband images. Wouldn't you agree? Or?
I mean that at the end of the day, the distortion, the level of distortions, the geometric distortions, depend on how much time you spend on the readout. So reading longer readout, more distortions. So if you match the readout duration between your single band 2D EPI acquisition and your multiband acquisition, I would expect exactly the same level of distortions. So I mean, given that you don't have any additional like slice leakage artifacts and all this kind of stuff, but in terms of distortions, they should be really identical between SMS and single band 2D EPI.
Yeah, I'll add that I got into and started inviting all these guys to ask questions about multiband imaging because I was seeing the motion traces from the motion regressors that were coming out of a standard processing pipeline, and they looked drastically different than what I was used to. So and we tracked it down to respiration, but I would highly suggest that anybody that is trying to use these sorts of higher resolution imaging schemes, especially for higher order cognitive tasks, to really look at the data closely. Don't just trust what comes out of the pipeline, because I don't know if I want to say artifacts, but the physiological noise components and stuff like that can be a lot more than what we're used to. And I'm not sure that anybody has a magic bullet for getting them out again, if it's even possible, theoretically.
Hey, thanks for a great talk. I was wondering about the subcortex, and obviously noticeably in the HCP pictures, the subcortex had just terrible SNR. And what are the possibilities for multiband in the subcortex compared to, say, up in the cortical layers where you can see some really big improvements?
I think the main thing is to use a lower SMS factor. So you use a 2 or 4. I mentioned that Todd paper. They also have a follow-up paper that recently came out in 2017. And so those papers talk a bit about that and modifying your acquisitions to reflect which areas of the brain you're interested in.
So yeah, maybe one comment. You said that you find these GMAPs disturbing, maybe from a statistical perspective. I actually find them okay because they reflect what you expect or what you would expect if you push the acceleration factor too far. So in that sense, it really tells you that your reconstruction is doing what you expect. And I guess the answer is that in that case, you really should reduce your multiband acceleration factor to get rid of these kind of effects.
Hi. Hi, thanks for the series of talks. So just to follow up on that, why are you recommending to go to a lower SMS factor for subcortical? I mean, is the G factor? Because my recommendation would be to go to higher voxel size.
So it's the G factor, but the G factor, so one version of a G factor, there's a couple versions, is when you don't have any in-plane acceleration, it's the standard deviation of your accelerated data over the standard deviation of your unaccelerated data. And so you see that the maps end up looking a lot like those residual variance maps I made from the HCP data, where you see the higher G factor in the subcortical area. So G factors and the residual variances I'm using kind of interchangeably.
I guess I would encourage people to look more at the higher voxel sizes than necessarily cutting your SMS factor.
Do you have any?
I mean, of course, if you cut your SMS factor, you get the advantage because you have the inherent more T1 recovery, so that's going to give you an advantage as well. But if you want that higher SMS factor for better denoising, I would consider maybe larger voxels, a little bit larger voxels, than necessarily cutting your SMS factor.
Sure, yeah, any kind of improvement in SNR that you get will help. Also reducing the echo time maybe if you have, particularly if you're interested in those areas that have a lot of iron in and short T2 star might also help.
Can you use, how big of a voxel can you use with a really high SMS factor? Because I'm thinking of what you had shown earlier with that the slice distance really matters. Is there a limit, do you guys see, for how far you can go?
In that slide, I was trying to address more the distance of the slices. So let's say if you have very thick slices, then you can, it's more the distance, the absolute distance that it approximately matches or should not be closer than the physical size of the channels. And that, of course, then only depends on the voxel size if you use the same kind of acceleration factor and reducing your slice thickness. It's mostly the distance of the slices, not the voxel size, that determines the effectiveness of the unaliasing. Yeah.
Hi. I wonder if you might say something more about the effect of motion with grappa and split slice grappa.
Yeah, we were having a discussion about this last night. We didn't really come to an agreement. In some respects, motion, especially along the z-axis, might be a big issue because it switches your grappa kernels and being applied to the wrong set of slices. On the other hand, the point that Renzo was making was your coil sensitivities are pretty smooth, so we don't expect those kernels to be that different. And so I think what we came to the conclusion of is we need to look at the kernels and see if they're very different between the different slices, which we haven't done.
And that refers to motion between the reference data and the EPI data the kernels is applied to. If you have the tiniest motion during the reference data acquisition, then it can really destroy everything. And then other ways of acquiring your reference data, such as this fleet from the MGH group or Flash, wise reference data acquisition can help to account for that motion. And it's not only real head motion, it's also the tiniest respiration-induced or physiological motion that can screw things up in that respect.
Hello. I'm interested in your experience regarding the tempo autocorrelations. So you've mentioned you've used an AR3 model for that. We didn't have such great experience with that when we went down with the repetition times, below 1 second effectively. Could you elaborate maybe or comment on that a bit?
Do you have an AR order that you were finding more preference for?
Certainly a higher one, but even then, I think it didn't work reliably, basically. So anywhere where we went down to less than 1 second repetition time, we thought we didn't have a good control over the statistics, and it was probably rather inflated, the results we got.
Yeah, so the way I settled on AR3, this was a couple of years ago, was looking at the maps of the coefficients for your AR coefficients, and once we got up to AR4, they looked a lot more random rather than having a spatial structure. So I'm being totally honest here, so it was not a very careful analysis, and at that time everyone was doing AR1, and we're like, okay, well, we'll code up AR3, and so that's, but I've seen a couple talks recently, and it sounds like we should be going up to a higher order.
Yeah, but I generally got the feeling of, also looking at the literature, listening to talks, that people really didn't have a good hold on it. And they start using these high accelerations, short repetition times, and do single subject analysis where it really matters that you estimate the effective degrees of freedom properly. And my gut feeling is the community doesn't have a really good hold on that at this point.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Yeah. And I guess on that note, we will end the session. So thank you all very much.